It's a neat figure for sure, and one that was needed in the collection for sure. But best figure of 2022? I don't know about that. I'm gonna have to disagree with what most people are concluding. Hi, Misha here, and well, kind of a cold opening looking at the most recent figure in the 6-inch Black Series collection of Star Wars figures. I thought we would talk about the life and times of one Maul. Previously, formerly Darth Maul, later just Maul. And these are the three we have. On the left, we have the Apprentice version, training version. In the middle, we have the classic version from the Phantom Menace, so the full Darth version. And on the right, we have the one just released, the Clone Wars version, probably the most famous and popular. So the only one we're really missing is the so-called Old Man Maul, but maybe one day we'll get that. Let's talk about him and these figures, and who he was. Let's see how well he stays on the spinny thing, or for how long. So yeah, this is the youngest version, the Apprentice version. Maul, he was born with a different name, but it's lost to time. He doesn't remember it, and it's never referred to. But we do know he was born in 54 BBY, so 54 years before A New Hope, the original Star Wars. His mother was Mother Talzin, who I always want to call Mother Townsend, and an unknown father. Basically, the situation on the planet of Dathomir. He's a Zabrak species, but he's from the planet Dathomir. Kind of like the episode of Star Trek Spock's Brain, where you have the I'm Morg and Morg thing. And so, yeah, the women just kind of picked a man and rolled with it. His mother was a Night Sister, the leader of them. They were considered Dathomirian witches, essentially dark side users, although maybe slightly gray. So that's what he was born to. He had a couple of brothers, including a younger brother named Savage, because this is Star Wars and names are weird. And he wasn't with his mother long. Even when he was a young child, he was force sensitive, had a good connection with nature, but he also had anger issues, rage issues, emotional turbulence, and this only got worse when he got a little bit older and was taken away and abused by the Night Brothers. And eventually, he would pop into a selection that Darth Sidious was making. In other words, at that time, Senator Palpatine, to pick a new apprentice. And he would pick Maul for his fiery temper and connection to the Force, and begin training him before he was 10 years old. Don't know exactly when, but sometime in the 40s BBY. And that's what this figure represents, him as a pretty young man, probably late teens, maybe early 20s, still in his training guise. And yes, this particular one is bare-chested. He-Man would be proud. Maul would grow up not to be terribly tall, about 5'9", about 1.75 meters. Red skin, red/yellow eyes, horns rather than hair. He was very acrobatic and muscular. He was very skilled at unarmed hand-to-hand combat, even if he wasn't relying on the Force. And he would construct his first lightsaber using materials he collected and also data from a Sith holocron that Sidious had. And he would build kind of a traditional ancient Sith staff saber. It was two independent sabers connected, although they could operate independently. Often he would not separate them, but he would sometimes use the secondary blade as a surprise tactic, only igniting one at a time. He was actually very skilled at twirling, spinning it, and he was very good at deflecting blaster bolts. And even when he was young, he was quite strong in the physical force, pushing, pulling, choking. But again, his athletic skill, even without, was quite good, and his skill with the saber, for anyone to operate a double blade, was pretty special. And he was raised by Sidious to hate the Jedi. Plus, he already had some resentment towards them for not finding him as a youngling and taking him to the temple, because he was Force sensitive. Hence why he went through quite a bit of abuse and everything. So he had his own personal resentment of Jedi, and Sidious encouraged that. And he was trained as a Sith warrior, Sith assassin, if you will. And I will say that Darth Maul, for me, from my generation, he's fine. He's kind of neat. But I've noticed for the next generation, the millennial generation that grew up with the Phantom Menace, he's an iconic character. And I think a lot of them felt kind of robbed that he was in and out of Phantom Menace so quickly. Only 3 or 4 lines, of course, played by Ray Park. So when he was brought back for the Clone Wars and Rebels, I think everyone thought that was a just desert. You know, sometimes characters are brought back when they don't really need to be, Palpatine. And sometimes characters weren't given enough screen time and are brought back and are well received. And that was definitely the case with Maul here. And you might think he was just kind of a dumb brute. But, and in The Phantom Menace, you don't get a lot of kind of other ideas, but through various other things, you start to see that he's actually a pretty good tactician, military planner, even a decent politician and economist, and yeah, eventually criminal. So yeah, this figure, pretty straightforward. People really like it. It's not really my favorite. I don't really like the bare skin thing. It feels kind of strange to me. I'm sure it looks fine. It does have the newer articulation and joints. The head moves very easily. Of course, the saber can separate into 2. It can also peg onto his belt. And you can pull the blades out if needed. These don't stick in too tight, unlike the Inquisitors. But they don't fall out either. They're just kind of loosely friction fit. It's probably done intentionally so they won't break off. But if they're a little too loose, you can always put a tad bit of blue tack in there. Of course, the legs move. There's these kind of rubbery skirts that get out of the way. But yeah, this is Maul. As an apprentice, he wanted to face Jedi, but had to wait. He actually would face one Jedi Padawan before meeting Qui-Gon and Obi-Wan in 32 BBY, but that was really his test by fire, and when he earned his title of Darth. So here he is in his most iconic and original look in his Sith robes. And this is where we meet him in Phantom Menace. He first encounters primarily Qui-Gon Jinn on Tatooine, and they fight a intense but brief duel before Qui-Gon is rescued. And then they meet up again at Naboo. It's interesting, he's actually there at Naboo before the Jedi get, and you can see him kind of scoping out, planning the fight, showing that he is more than just an animal. He plans where he's going to kind of take them, starting off more or less in the hangar, outer parts, and then moving into the reactor cores, looking at the pit, and hoping to challenge the Jedi. By this point, he's actually quite skilled with the saber, but he also has been taught some espionage and other tactics. He's also piloting a very advanced ship called the Scimitar, which is a Sith fighter, kind of analogous to an early TIE fighter that we've looked at in other videos. Should I have gotten it out for this one? Probably. Did I? Nah. But yeah, this is the first Maul we get, and probably the one that comes with the most stuff too. So this time I have his staff saber turned off, and I've got it pegged to his belt. It's pretty long without the blades ignited, about 20 inches, both hilts. He also comes with these binoculars that we see him use on Tatooine. We also see him using spy droids, and he does have these kind of robes on. Interesting the way they did this figure. The head, which is part of the robe, pops off, and if you want to, you can put on this head instead. Not only does that give him an uncloaked head, Hello. It takes part of his robes off, so more of a fighting thing. So this is more of his espionage look originally, and then you can get him more in a fighting thing. This is the archive version, but it's pretty much an update of the original one that was released early on in the Black Series. And what they were doing back then was kind of one figure that could be put in a couple of different styles to represent different eras. The Yoda is the same way, and several others. But yeah, this is the Maul look. So at this point, he's well trained. He's a Darth, and he's going against the Jedi. And at first, the battle goes very well for him. He seems to be matching toe-to-toe with Qui-Gon, and actually seems to be outclassing Obi-Wan. He eventually does defeat Qui-Gon, smacking him in the face with his saber, and then stabbing him. And it ends up disarming Obi-Wan and actually getting him hanging off a shaft. It's only kind of through arrogance on Maul's part and luck on Obi-Wan's that Obi-Wan was able to use not his own saber because it's lost, but Qui-Gon's discarded saber getting out and bisecting old Maul here, slicing him in half, pretty much chopping off his legs. There's his saber. You can see how it just pegs on. It's very long. It does separate too, for what it's worth. So you can do that, because in the duel, Obi-Wan actually does cut it in half, and one half is destroyed, and the other half Maul continues to fight on with for a time until he's cut in half, and he, still holding one half of his saber, falls down the reactor pit. And for a number of years, that was the canonical end to Darth Maul. So he does not appear or even really mentioned in Episode 3 of Revenge of the Sith, or even Episode 2 Attack of the Clones. By this point, Darth Sidious had taken a new apprentice, Darth Tyrannus, Count Dooku, and eventually Anakin Skywalker, Lord Vader. And he would seem to be forgotten. That is, until we get to the 2008 series, Clone Wars. After a little while, I think it's Season 2, he reemerges. Actually, first we meet his brother, Savage Opress. Sounds like an alien porn star name, I'm not going to lie. And Mother Townsend tells, and yes, I know what I just said, Townsend, tells Savage that actually Maul survived and is living in an Outer Rim world, Lothal Minor. And turns out when he fell down the shaft, he actually arrested his fall by catching a grate, getting into a trash chute, and eventually catching a garbage scow and making it to an off-world planet. It's said that, yeah, he used the dark side to stay alive. Also keep in mind he was cut using a lightsaber, which would cauterize the wound, and his Zabrak physiology, alien physiology, not to mention the Night brother sister magic, but whatever, it doesn't matter. He lived. So he basically has two driving goals. He wants revenge against Obi-Wan, obviously, and also Darth Sidious, as he feels betrayed. Otherwise, he goes quite insane, living on a junk planet, kind of being a mythological creature, and he has no legs. So what he ends up doing, at least in the beginning, is fashioning himself a little kind of insectoid, six-legged thing, and it's made out of scrap parts. This is how Savage finds him. He's still quite loopy, and after some shenanigans, Savage takes the mentally and physically wounded Maul back to Dathomir, to their mother, and she heals him mentally, and then also fashions him new robot legs made from discarded parts from Separatist battle droids, because there had been a fight on Dathomir earlier. And so that gets us to our third figure. Now in his second pair of robot legs, and after healing up on Dathomir, and after a bit of power struggle, not major, between him and Savage, Maul took Savage as his apprentice. This is kind of late 22 BBY. And at this time, he still claims the title of Darth, actually feeling like he and Savage are the true inheritors of Bane and the rule of two, and that Sidious is the pretender. Either way, they get into some shenanigans, and Maul does quite well. He's still just using half of his lightsaber staff, so one. He improves his abilities in the Force, getting quite good at Mind Probe and other skills. The thing about the dark side users being chopped in half, suffering pain, insanity, that just feeds into their whole dark side thing. So that plus just the carnage of the Clone Wars just makes him stronger. He still seems to be quite skilled compared to Obi-Wan. He goes up against several other Jedi, even killing some. But after one battle, he loses one of his robot legs, and Savage loses an arm. And they eventually find themselves adrift in space in a escape pod running out of air. It looks like that's their end, but then they're found by Death Watch, led by Pre Vizsla, i.e. Jon Favreau. And he sees their lightsabers, and once he learns that they're not Jedi, he kind of gets a enemy of my enemy is my friend attitude, and they cook up a plan together. And this really shows Maul's skill. The idea, Maul wants to co-opt several criminal organizations, the Hutts, Black Sun, the Pikes, into what's known as the Shadow Collective, and then they're to rain terror and disruption on Mandalore, which will discredit the current government led by Duchess Satine Kryze. I don't know, whatever. And then Death Watch with Vizsla will come in and stabilize things and arrest Maul and be the heroes, and then they'll kind of split the spoils behind the scene. This shows that while he wanted power, he didn't want to be necessarily the figurehead like Palpatine. So they get this in through many shenanigans and a lot of persuasion of the Hutts and killing them. They kind of force Jabba's hand, and this is pretty much what happens. And then Pre Vizsla betrays Maul and Savage, putting them in prison and stripping them of their lightsabers. One thing I should add before we move on, when they were recovering Pre Vizsla at their hidden base on the moon of Zanbar, gave him this set of robot legs, actual synthetic legs, instead of kind of scavenged parts. They also gave Savage the cybernetic arm. So that's kind of where we're going here. Maul knew that Pre Vizsla would betray him, so they had a plan to break out of jail already. Note that he wasn't the first to do the betraying. It's hard to say if he would have stuck to the deal or not. Either way, so we have Pre Vizsla with his lieutenant, Bo-Katan, who was already uneasy about Maul and Savage. They get out of prison, in which they also meet a disgraced Prime Minister, Almec, there. He'll come into play in a minute. And knowing the Mandalorian culture, he challenges Pre Vizsla to a duel in the throne room. And being still a Mandalorian, Pre Vizsla, who's wielding the Darksaber, orders Bo-Katan to give Darth Maul back his saber so they can fight. And they do. And Vizsla does well. In fact, he actually disarms Maul, but Maul has the Force, and he's quite physically strong, plus robot legs. He ends up disarming Pre Vizsla and beheading him with the Darksaber. And this is an interesting quandary for the Mandalorians. By rights, he defeated in straightforward, honorable combat, and he possesses the Darksaber, so Maul should lead Mandalore. But many will not accept a non-Mandalorian doing so. So this splits Death Watch, who had taken over from Duchess Satine, who is now in prison herself. They really like putting people in prison. And so you have Bo-Katan leading the rebels, the Night Owls, and you have the Super Commandos, part of Death Watch that sided with Darth Maul. And we start to see the rumblings of a Mandalorian civil war, and Maul's power is growing. And this actually is a problem for him because it brings Darth Sidious to Mandalore. He knew that Maul was alive, but up until now he wasn't a threat. He needs to curb this, and so they fight, Savage and Maul against Darth Sidious, and for a minute they hold their own, but soon Sidious will kill Savage and disarm and torture Maul. And while Sidious leaves Maul alive for his own purposes, this is about the time that Maul gives up the claim to Darth and even connection to the Sith outright, but not the dark side, of course. Next, Sidious takes Maul as a prisoner, disarming him, and takes him to a prison planet. But Almec, who had basically control of the Super Commandos, in a show of true loyalty, and also showing that Maul picks his allies quite well, rescues him, sends a rescue party, saying it's payback for getting him out of prison. So, decent enough, surprisingly. And so Maul goes back to Mandalore, and he recovers his original half-saber here. Good day that dates all the way back to his apprentice days. And it's around this time he actually reforges it. This is the other saber that came with the robot leg figure. Notice that it's a different style. It's not known within canon where he gets it, but it is known that he will reforge into a double-bladed again, if I can find the right peg. There we go. These are kind of keyed so you can put the right way. So once again, in 19 BBY, he has a staff saber, just in time for the siege of Mandalore. We'll just say he's getting ready to hop. But yeah, here he is with his full staff again. And just in time, too, because he's going to be fighting not only the Night Owls, but soon clones, and will eventually go up against Ahsoka Tano. He had already faced Mace Windu and General Grievous, and actually came out quite well. Like I said, he even did okay against Sidious, so he's not weak at all. And his planning, of course, is thrown awry because Savage is dead. And Almec is still Prime Minister, but he's the power behind the throne. But it won't last long with the Republic coming into Mandalore. Now, he does have this scheme to lure Obi-Wan there because he still wants revenge. He knows that when the Duchess gets out of prison, escapes, that she'll call Obi-Wan, and she surely does. And Maul sets a trap, and after some shenanigans, shooting down their spacecraft, he basically murders her with the Darksaber in front of Obi-Wan, which is quite an emotional part of the Clone Wars. But now we move on to kind of the new Season 7 and the Siege of Mandalore, and we see him with this double saber again. And he does fight Ahsoka, and seems to mostly get the upper hand, but she gets some good licks in. But part of it is he's trying to convince her to join him. They're both outsiders. She's gray, he's gray. Even if he's on the dark side, she's on the light. You know, they both are disillusioned. Plus, he knows about Sidious's plans and about Vader coming, well, at least Anakin being turned. So they fight on. And eventually, through a few tricks of fate, she will win, capturing him, and he will lose this staff permanently. It'll fall into the city below, and there you have it. And he'll be imprisoned in a Mandalorian vault, which kind of suppresses force powers, and put onto a Venator. And per order of the Jedi Council, they're heading back to Coruscant when Order 66 happens. And Ahsoka is quite useful with Maul. 2 clones are ordered specifically by Sidious to kill him. He's pretty much helpless in his vault. But before they can do that, Ahsoka kills them and frees him. Refusing to give him one of her sabers, she lets him loose on the ship as a distraction, and he does very well. Order 66 has further strengthened his power, and he rips apart deck plates, killing clones by the Force, and then eventually he makes his way to the hyperdrive and the reactor, and it basically just breaks him with the Force, and that causes the Venator to crash on a moon, And despite clones trying to stop him, he eventually takes the shuttle into hyperspace and escapes into the galaxy as the new Empire forms. And that's where our figure here kind of leaves us, because he's the Clone War Maul. Just to give some things, the Inquisitors, who we've talked about recently, did try to track him down, but they couldn't. He's nicknamed the Shadow, and he still wants to get revenge on Sidious, and he thinks Kenobi's dead because of Order 66. He goes to various Sith temples and tries doing things. He also reaffirms his commitment to criminal organizations, being part of Crimson Dawn and then leading it. Of course, we meet up with him very briefly at the end of Solo, which is, I think, 10 BBY, where he's commanding that. And then the next time we run into him, at least of note, is 3 BBY with Rebels. And it's kind of interesting that he popped into Rebels. Much as he wanted Ahsoka as his apprentice, he now focuses on Ezra Bridger. There's a bunch of back and forth. He kind of manipulates him, lying about who he is. By this point, he's kind of playing up the old man Maul. Keep in mind, he's not super old, a little over 50. Seems like people in Star Wars don't age much until they hit about 45, then they get really old really quick. And by this point, he has a new lightsaber. We see it in Solo. It's a double blade, but it seems to be formed from part of an Inquisitor's hilt, which makes sense. We know he's killed at least a few of them. He eventually will kill the 5th brother and the 7th sister, and kind of causes the 8th brother to die. But it's neither here nor there. There's a bunch of shenanigans. He blinds Kanan Jarrus, faces Ahsoka a couple more times, and steals a TIE Advanced. He does his thing in the 2 BBY, still wanting to try to get Ezra. But then he learns that Obi-Wan is alive, and eventually figures out that he's on Tatooine, and that's where Maul's story finally ends. Beginning as a young Zabrak, stolen from his home and corrupted by the dark side and Dark Sidious and all that, through his days as a Dark Lord of the Sith, as a Darth, to his days as a wannabe teacher and criminal mastermind and political figure with robot legs. That's Maul's story. It's quite varied. In his old age, he's very powerful in the Force, especially things like Mind Probe and telekinesis and all that stuff. Still very skilled with the saber, even his older age. But, yeah, he traces Kenobi to Tatooine, and their duel there is quite brief. Thinking that he'll easily defeat Obi-Wan, who's aged even more than he has. Keep in mind, we're just a couple of years out from A New Hope, where Obi-Wan looks to be like 70, when he's actually like 50-something. In the end, it actually turns out that Obi-Wan quickly cuts his saber in two again, slicing him in the chest, and that's the end. Although he does seem to die with some peace rather than rage. Probably the first time he's felt that since he was a handful of years old. Kind of rushing through the second part of his life because we don't really have a figure for that. Maybe one day we'll get one. That'll be nice. And also, we will take a closer look at his lightsaber when I do the video on Sith sabers. So, my final thoughts and yours? I think it's great that the younger generation, well, younger, they're in their 30s now for sure, really identifies with Darth Maul and his lightsaber staff. And he's very much a classic George Lucas villain. Kind of a little bit predictable, but also cool and unique. And I think everyone's glad he was brought back. He was brought back the right way for Clone Wars. When you think about this figure, I like how his little horns, there's little bumps on the hood. Again, the hood's not removable from the head. You just pop the whole thing off. I could, but I'm not going to. But I really like this figure, the original one. It comes with the most accessories. But of course, articulation's pretty limited. A little better when you take the cloak off. This cloak has some flex to it. It's not, even can kind of bunch up. It's very thin rubber, which is good. But still, there's even some cloth under here in some of the skirts. But I guess that's probably why a lot of people like this one when it came out, because it is very articulated, especially the upper. They also use this mold for the Knight, Brother, Warrior, and Archer, and a few other things. And this was in the comic books, but same basic mold, just shirtless, because I don't know. I'm not going to say anything. Again, we had He-Man and G.I. Joe's, plenty of shirtless there. So, you do you, guys. You do you. Legs are fine. A little less articulated, but the upper is really good, especially the pin joints. And you can peg this saber onto his belt, too, but this one definitely seems to be more action Maul. And then we have, of course, our newest robot Maul. And as I said at the very beginning, in a lot of Black Series videos, a lot of different people, this is their favorite figure of 2022. I get it. For one thing, he was definitely needed for the collection. Just the whole clone look. He was so much in that and Rebels and everything. But while it's well done, I can't help but feel like he's missing something. 2 sabers, good. They can connect. Robot legs, great. I kind of wish they had done more of a deluxe thing and maybe given you abilities to swap out robot legs, because he had 3 different sets. If they couldn't do the 6-legged one, maybe give the first set, or the second set, and the third swappable legs would have been kind of neat. Failing that, maybe a cloak or the dark saber. I know we've had the dark saber with a few other people before. I just feel like he needs a couple more accessories to accentuate what he did. There's a few different things it could have been. Heck, even give him the comlink from the Siege of Mandalore that he uses on the Venator. Or maybe even the other style of lightsaber. That would have been kind of neat. Maybe the old man style. You could have the kind of bent hilt type. I don't know. I just feel like he could have used a little more accessorization, or at least a cloak. A little more plain than I expected. But he is well done. There's no way about it. So I'm going to say my favorite is still the original, especially the archive version. He's my second favorite. And then this one, well, not a bad figure at all. Maybe I'm just not into shirtless men look, but I don't know, he's fine too. He too doesn't really come with a whole lot. But either way, I feel like this would be a good time to do a Life and Times of Maul. So let me know what you think about him. If you're my generation or the older one or the younger one, I'd love to hear your opinions below and what you think of these figures. And again, we'll look closer at the lightsaber staff in a follow-up video when we look at other dark side weapons. This is Misha. Catch you very soon next time.